Hi everyone, I hope this video finds you well. I'm Diego Alvarez. I just got my master's degree in education with this research project called Microlearning as an English Reinforcement Strategy in sixth grade students in a private school in Bucaramanga. I'm an English language teacher here in Colombia, and I'm going to share with you, first of all, 3 videos related to the development of these research projects for you to have a short understanding of what was done during this project. So we're going to start with micro-learning. That was the learning strategy that I used. It's going to start with this video. I hope you enjoy.
What is microlearning? Microlearning is a method of learning via short, standalone units that are consumed via digital media. Small chunks of information served where and when we need them. Microlearning consists of micro-lessons that quickly teach us something concrete without interrupting our workflow or overwhelming us with information, as opposed to hour-long courses and training seminars. Why do micro-lessons make sense? Psychologist George Miller states that the brain can only retain 5 to 9 facts before either committing them to long-term memory storage or losing them. That's why shorter lessons make sense. What does microlearning look like? The format is often video, but can also be a fact sheet, an infographic, a slideshow, or a chatbot, as long as it's digital and mobile. But microlearning is defined less by its format than by its functionality, to answer a specific question. In both education and in business, microlearning is trending because it fits well with the way we like to consume information today. When we have a question, we pull out our phones and Google our way to immediate answers. We also want to learn this way. Is microlearning something new? The idea of bite-sized learning nuggets is not new. It's traditionally called incremental learning. What is new is that this tried and true approach to learning is applied to the digital world, where most of us have a phone or tablet, and many study or work from home. Microlearning's popularity is also on the rise because we experience a time crunch. We don't feel like we have the time for training, although we do know it's important to our careers and lives to stay sharp and learn new skills. So, microlearning becomes a solution where we can squeeze in a 5-minute learning session in between other tasks. How to apply microlearning? To work well in practice, microlearning must be available on demand, no need to schedule a time or plan ahead, searchable, it's not enough with category pages or tables of contents, flexible, available whenever and wherever, and useful in itself, no need for a longer course and additional supporting material to understand the lesson. Like this video, it's an example of microlearning. You demanded it now, so you searched for it, probably watched it on your phone, and it's a standalone piece of content, not a part of some course. Now you know what microlearning is.
Okay, so this was the first video related to the way I talked English here. Now, the second video will be about the mean that I use for teaching this content.
People love to stay in touch, whether that's talking to friends and family on video calls, messaging through apps, or touching base while working remotely. Gamers are no different. That's why online gaming and chatting go together like Han and Chewie. But gamers have always faced 2 problems: how to talk to one another and how to organise people to get an online game going. Discord is one such app that was created by the gamers for the gamers to solve problems. But outside of the gamers' realm, what is Discord all about? It's an easy-to-use, free communications app, similar to apps like Skype or Slack, but aimed mainly at gamers with a lot more features. Discord lets friends chat with each other one-to-one or as a group via a server. It provides user-friendly text, voice, screen sharing, and video chat services through public or private servers that can be set up pretty quickly. No doubt, Discord started out as a gamer's chat app and became quite famous for it, but its users started finding non-gaming ways of using this platform, which inspired Discord to make some changes. Then COVID-19 happened, which forced everybody to social distance and communicate via chatting platforms. So, because of its users and the pandemic, Discord thought about growing beyond its only for gamers image, and now it wants to be seen as a general purpose chat app for everyone with non-gaming needs and wants, to go mainstream all over the world, just like Zoom. And you won't believe that it's being used for anything and everything that you can think of, from large corporate meetings to job recruitment, from live karaoke nights to virtual wedding parties. The possibilities are pretty endless. That's why they have changed the branding and introduced a new tagline that specifically says, "It's your place to talk." In short, Discord is projecting itself as the future of platforms, where you can chat with friends, learn something online, or just share ideas, even if you're not into gaming, which are quite rare breed.
Okay, and the last one, this took place, this is called Bucaramanga. This is the city in which I am currently now. So I hope you enjoy the view of my city. Well, as you could see in the video, my city is placed surrounded by buildings. It's a growing city. It's one of the top five biggest cities here in Colombia, and it's just by the side of a mountain. So we're not considered a poor city. We're a growing up city in the middle of a developmental area with quite a few companies around. So I'm going to start now with my presentation. I hope you enjoy it. Okay, after this short introduction, I'm going to start with my presentation. 83 years have passed since Colombia has imposed its educative model of 6 years of English language at school. So it is important that if Colombia have taken part of the increase of English language at school, and the goals that it has proposed have not been met. Education First is a company that offers courses of languages over the world, decided to measure the academic performance in English language. An example of this is that in 2022, with the same English exam, similar countries such as Panama, Venezuela, and Nicaragua scored way better than Colombia during that year. According to some sources of the government, one of the main causes of this situation in academic performance in English in Colombia is due to the lack of technology, not only in technology that is being used in the classrooms, but also the technology access in households throughout Colombia. According to the National Department of Statistics, DANE, by 2019, the proportion of households that had access to internet connection was shown in this chart. The arrow shows Santander. Santander is the state in which this research project was carried out. And at that year, it showed that only 60% of households had access to internet connection. Remember that by the 2019, it was a year before COVID-19. So by 2021, the National Department of Statistics showed this chart again. And in this time, Santander was located with 64% of coverage in households with internet connection. So it shows an increase in the access to technological devices, in this case with internet. So this led to other aspects. For example, also the National Department of Statistics by the 2021 wanted to know what was the proportion of people aged above over 5 years old, who use the cell phone, and what kind of devices did they use to have access to internet. So it shows that it was by cell phones that most of the people in the survey had internet connection. And the second one was through a laptop, and the third and the fourth one with similar proportions were with smart TVs and desktops. So also it was important, if they had access to internet connection, what did they use it for? So having into account the before mentioned chart, people use their smartphones in three different ways. Basically, not only smartphones, but the other means of connecting to internet. So in this part, we're going to only focus on the smartphones. So this chart is divided into three bars. The red one shows entertaining, the blue one shows work, and the last one, the green one, shows education. So people in Colombia, well, in this case, in Bucaramanga, Santander, use their cell phones, their internet connection for entertaining. And 20% use it to work, and only 12% use it for education. So thanks to all these changes, that we could say so, and the incorporation of new technologies in the classroom, thanks to a simple observation during my classes, I could realize that students from very early ages, for example, from 7 years old and on, start using or start bringing their cell phones to classrooms. So with this new expansion of technology to classrooms, with the arrival of these new platforms for education, for example, Classroom from Google, the proliferation also of mobile games, and the lack of time that perhaps students had to study a new thing, this gave it as a result my proposal, my research proposal, to start using all these things in one, and merging them in one, so I could take advantage of this and also my students. The strategy selected had many phases, different stages, and took into account three main aspects. For example, the first one was the use of Discord, that it was the platform that was presented at the beginning. This platform was selected because the most of the students during the research had this platform, and they use it actively while they playing. So that was the platform, that was the mean to transmit information to students. The second one was microlearning, that, as I told you, it was the learning strategy that I used for this project, because in this, using this, I could divide the knowledge that I wanted to share with my students into chunks, and I could share those chunks of information, of pieces of information, via Discord, right? And also, I had to measure their advance during this implementation. So the reading comprehension was skill selected to evaluate their knowledge. All these three things led this strategy to one thing. Well, basically to two things. the improvement of the academic performance in English, and also, of course, learning in English as a whole, right? So, first of all, I had to diagnose their initial knowledge of the students, of the participants in this research project. So, initial test was carried out to establish their previous knowledge. As you can see, it was all with reading comprehension because the National Department of Education here in Colombia measure or assess students here through reading comprehension, not only English but also the other subjects. So students will be very familiar with this kind of tests. For the design, I took into account the ideas of a linguist called Ferdinand de Saussure with the linguistic sign. As you can see, there is a signification. There's the things that give meaning. For example, is the word plus the image, right? That is the mental concept of that word. And also the pragmatic and syntagmatic axis. In this case, how can a word link to another without being mixed up? For example, I can say a silly person jumped into a river or into the river, right? But I cannot say the other way around. The pond into fell person silly. I mean, with this example, these linguists show that there is a rational way of associating words. It's not just adding words as you want, at your will, but there must be a rational order for using them. So basically, the structural part of the language was taken from Ferdinand de Saussure. Before starting the implementation process, I must to describe how was this research project. This was a quasi-experimental one, and it had two groups, one experimental and the other control. The experimental group was the one who received the strategy. In this case, the strategy was to implement the use of Discord to receive the chunks of information that I wanted my students to receive. On the other hand, the control group received guides on their emails as normal guides, as in the traditional method is used to do. So what is important here is the creation of a new learning environment for students. You should remember that Discord had two ways for using it. One is to create channels of voice, and the other one, channels of text. In this case, this channel was used for texting because the only interaction that I wanted to have with my students was just with the exposure of the videos that I created for them as an academic reinforcement for the English classes that I had at school. Here, you can see the guides that receive the control group students, which had the same information that I used in the videos. The only difference was the medium. They received the information on the videos via Discord, and the control group received the same information, but in plain text with some images to illustrate the examples on their emails. Now, finally, I had the final evaluation process to measure how much have they learned so far. Not only the students that went through the process of Discord, but also the students that received the guides through the emails. So a post-test was assigned to students taking into account the same items that I had into account for the initial test. It was basically the same structure exam, but it had different topics. However, those topics were related, both exams, even the initial one as the final one, they both had the same topics, but they were different in essence. They had different questions. Also, at the beginning of the division of the group, the topics to teach the students were selected. And during this implementation, the classes were the same for both groups, even for the control as for the experimental group. They had the same classes, they received the same classes at school, but they received from different mediums the academic reinforcement online after the class. As for the evaluation part, the final test, I took into account the same aspects as I took in the initial test to get validation of this exam. They had the same topics to evaluate, the same parts, and the same essence. The only difference with this, they both had different questions, but in essence, they were basically the same. They were evaluating the same thing. So at the end, I could see the statistical results and I could know the difference between the initial test and the post-test, not only with one group, but contrasting both groups, experimental and control group. So this study statistically demonstrated that students who use Discord as reinforcement strategy achieve better academic performance than those who use a traditional strategy in the area of English. For this research project, two variables were taken into account. One that was independent variable, that was microlearning. That this one was delivered by two methods. One, the video that was for the experimental group, and the other one was in text that was through the guides that the control group received. But remember that both of them had exactly the same material. And the other one was to the dependent variable that we wanted with this microlearning impact the academic performance in English for both students, for both groups. The theories and educational currents that impacted the development of this research were, first of all, the connectivism that students could learn not only from the teacher, but also from the things outside the classroom that the teacher provides to students. The connectivism with George Simmons and Stephen Downes. And with the learning theory, it was taken from Stephen Krashen. Also, I took some important laws from the psychology of learning of Edward Thorndike, the structural part of English language from the general linguistics from Ferdinand de Saussure, and finally, the use of microlearning, that was the fragmentation of all these details of the language by Theo Hawk. So, to sum up, this is like the general structure of this research program. What were the most relevant characteristics in this study? So first, the type of the research, that it was quantitative, as I told you, and quasi-experimental one. So it led to be divided into two groups, experimental and control group. The population was the sixth graders in private school in Bucaramanga, and were divided into two groups. As I told you, the control group they received the guides through text, and the experimental group that they received the information through videos. And the sample selection was convenience sampling, because this population that I had for this research, they were my students assigned by the same school. So I didn't have to look for them. I just had them assigned randomly. So it was convenient sampling. So how I developed this research. This is the whole view of what I did. At the beginning, the population was of 170 students. And at the initial test, I took those students and they were divided into control and experimental. At the beginning, they were 75 students, they went to control, and 85 students, they went to experimental. However, as the process went by, they were decreasing in number because of the selection filters. The selection filter was basically that they were present in each stage of the implementation that went from the beginning, from the initial test until the final test. So in the intervention process, that it was the acceptance of the invitation of Discord, the submission of the email accounts to the teacher. So at the end of this phase, they were 60 in the group control and 70 in the experimental group, okay? So then at the final test, they were 45 of each group. At the end, the population was of 90 students. And how this data was analyzed? It was the first one was living test that basically helped me to check if if both groups as the control and the experimental were evenly distributed. So I used that test for that purpose. And I used the t-test for related samples and the t-tests for not related samples that we're going to check it later on. The measurement artifacts that I used, as I told you before, the initial test and the final test was an adaptation of A2 key Cambridge assessment test, right? So that exam was already designed. However, I took some parts of that exam, I mean the reading parts exam, and I took them and I modified them for the purpose of this research project. Also, another aspect taken into account for these measurement artifacts was a series of guides or rules that I had to take into account because of the Ministry of Education in Colombia. I need to follow certain things in order to be able to teach them at school. And also, the last one was this, ICFES, that's the entity in charge of measure the knowledge of students, not only in the last year, but through all the school years. This entity measure or delivers exams periodically to know how is the performance of those students at school, not only in public schools, but also in all kind of schools. And final one, as it was a reading comprehension strategy, I had two things or two aspects to take into account to evaluate that reading comprehension process. It had literal questions and inferential questions. So here I describe what were the process taken into account for the formulation of the questions. What new things brought this research project? It created new learning spaces. Maybe this platform, Discord, wasn't used for students to receive any academic information, but in this time, they accepted my invitation, they joined my channel, and through this channel, they received the information that I wanted them to study. And each video lasted around 3 minutes, 2 minutes and a half, maximum 3 minutes and a half. So the exposure time that they had to be watching them for not interrupting their activities, their normal activities, it was really minimum. And also the use of their emails was useful for them because that way they receive information created by the teacher and they were studying through these guides. Although it wasn't a very popular method, students were willing to learn from these guides. According to the analysis, it was evidence that definitely Discord was the best option for students, not only because they had better scores on the final test, but also because during this activity, the students cleared that they actually felt better while using Discord to study rather than receiving things on email. Although they both increased on their final results, students felt better or they were more comfortable using this gaming platform because they were in a familiar environment for them. They were using them with their classmates, and not only just for gaming, but also they use it for a good purpose that was learning English in this time. So these were the final figures that I received. So for the control group in the initial test, they had a mean of 45.9, and in the final test, they had a mean of 51.2. So here at the beginning, we can see that there is a slight increase in their marks. So let's check the experimental group. The experimental group started with a mean of 38. However, it turned out that at the end, they had 58.5 in the mean. At the beginning, it wasn't in numbers, they weren't the same. However, statistically speaking, we cannot say that these numbers were too far to mention that they were not homogeneous group, right? And if we compare both final tests, both academic results, in the experimental group, we had a bigger proportion than the control group. So statistically speaking, I can say that from this research, it was better to use Discord rather than using just email and guides to reinforce the academic performance of students. So with this chart, we can see the statistical figures that we received from this research project. At the beginning, I told you that with the initial test, well, I carried out a living test. So that gave us a result. Well, I had a p-value or an alpha of 0.05. In this case, as this p-value is higher than my alpha, I can conclude that there was no difference with the initial test. So statistically speaking, I can say that both groups had a similar knowledge of English when they started. However, if we compare the final test, this gave us a p-value of less of my alpha. That means that there was a difference between these two groups. So the difference positive for the experimental group, the one that received Discord as a academic reinforcement. Now, in terms of looking at both groups individually, from the initial test to the final test, the t-test resulted as a p-value of 0.1. So this means that is higher than my alpha. So it means that statistically speaking, these two values were basically identical. Now, if we check the aftermath of this experimental group, the p-value was less than my alpha. So it means that there was a difference in terms of statistics here. So the biggest conclusion here was that the impact of the control group, although there was an advance, there was an increase in the final test in terms of numbers, this increase wasn't strong enough to say that there was a difference between these two results. However, if we take this, statistically speaking, I can say that it had an improvement in terms of grades. So this led to students, if they happen to receive this academic reinforcement through Discord, they are more likely to pass an exam, for example, if we're talking about numbers, right? So the impact of the study. I'm not saying that Discord must be the solution to all students. However, this fact is very important to mention. I use this platform because my students already used it, right? So I think that the impact of the study is that if we happen to use a platform of a medium that our students are currently using, perhaps we could get a better impact on them because the affective filter for these kind of platforms are lowered because they are already using them. In this way, we could use the micro learning. We can start to decompose this big material that we sometimes have for our students and starting deliver them little by little. That way, perhaps students can understand it better, and at the end, they can grab all this knowledge that they may have and create their own knowledge with help of the teachers, of course. On the other hand, the use of guides are useful as the traditional method is used to do. The point here is that no matter if we use alternative things or traditional things, the important fact here is that if we happen to give or provide the students with more information, with more opportunities to learn, they will eventually perform better in exams or even have a better grasp of the topic that we are talking about. So another aspect to take into account in further research could be to have into account the perspective of students. Maybe for your students, Discord won't be very useful. However, if you ask them what other platform you could use in order to deliver them material that you create, it would be great because they can provide you with information that you perhaps don't know. In this case, it was Discord. Perhaps in your case, as a teacher, it could be a language teacher or any other teacher. Remember that this material was about decomposing our message. So if we can decompose this material and deliver to our students, not only talking about students, but also let's talk about companies that need that their workers learn a new aspect of a machine or a procedure that they need to know that thing. We can use any other platform for use this delivery, and we can decompose it or fragment it to have a better digestion of this information. Also, it is important that Discord in this case was used outside the class. But how about if we use Discord or any other platform during the class time? Sometimes we teachers are afraid of using technology in class because it can be a focus of distraction. But I strongly believe that if you use technology in a good way, you can achieve great things. Another one we have to take into account students' participation. Maybe if you carry a similar research project, I think that you should also evaluate the way that students feel about these methods. I just asked them I just asked them how did they feel, but it wasn't part of the real research that I carried out. So in further research, you could perform the same research project, but also in addition questions like how did you feel with the implementation process, right? So you could create your own research project, but not a quantitative one, but it could be a mixed one, right? That you can have the quantitative aspect and also the qualitative aspect. Before finishing, I would like to highlight some final thoughts about this research project. The first one is teachers can use this method of microlearning when he or she need to explain several things to the same topic without consuming extra time. Number two would be it can be useful for teachers due to the fact that they can create their own content without fearing that students can find misleading information on the web. And the last one, teachers can use these short videos even from their lesson plans to foresee difficulties in the most important topics. And those videos can be shared to students so they can watch them beforehand as flipped learning. So this was my presentation. That was all for today. I hope that you liked my presentation. If you have any comments or advice, I'd be willing to answer all your questions or your requests in the session disposed for this. Have a good one. My name was Diego Alvarez. I'm from Colombia, and I'm very passionate for language learning and also psychology of learning. Bye. Take care.